A look at the Vietnam War. Imagine the jungle, bugs everywhere. You are stuck 9,000 miles away from home, fighting a war that you didn't want to. Your country's citizens don't want this, and they're going to hate you for it. That's not hard to imagine. That's the Vietnam War. With war in Ukraine and Israel, it's not hard to see that there are parallels to what's going on with what happened in the past. With history's persistence to repeat itself, it's important to remember the failures that have come throughout one of the major battles in U.S. history. I did research through the National History Channel, the Britannica Encyclopedia, and the National Archives, which I used to get information for this. The best way to view the Vietnam War is chronologically, from the context that it's set up in, as well as the actual happenings of the war and the lasting effects that we see even to this day. To understand the Vietnam War, it's important to look at what the context is, what led up to U.S. involvement. In World War II, Japanese Imperial Army and forces invaded Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, a political leader, formed the Viet Minh, or the communist leader. He was inspired by the Chinese and Soviet Union, and U.S. supported the Viet Minh throughout the Second World War to fight off the Japanese. In September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed independence for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The declaration paraphrased the U.S. Declaration of Independence, and it even said along the lines, all men are born equal. The Creator has given us inviolable rights, life, liberty, and happiness. France looks to Vietnam. Following this, French forces entered South Vietnam and entered talks with the Vietnamese Communist Party. France sought to control by backing the French-educated Emperor Bao Dai, setting the southern city of Saigon as the new capital in July of 1949. Both sides seek to unify Vietnam. However, things quickly broke down and led to conflicts between both parties. Eventually, you saw the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which the French lost spectacularly, and in the 57-day battle, 2,200 French were killed, with 11,000 captured, with many dying in captivity before they could get home. Following the pullout of French from Vietnam is the entrance of Americans in June of 1954. The start of the Vietnam War is often considered when Air Force Colonel Edward Lansdale started operations of paramilitary, often training South Vietnamese to fight. This only included roughly less than 800 people. Ngo Dinh Diem was appointed president following the Geneva Convention that divided Vietnam on the 17th parallel. His government was supported by many anti-communist parties, including the U.S. However, he faced insurgency under the Viet Cong as a result of some of his policies, including the Strategic Hamlet Project, which limited the Vietnamese people to small, enclosed areas. However, Diem was Catholic. This didn't align with a lot of the Buddhist population in Vietnam, and led to Buddhists, including those who set themselves on fire. And on the 1st of November 1963, South Vietnamese generals led a coup d'etat, which ultimately ended with Diem and his brother dying. The Viet Cong was created mainly when 100,000 suspicious individuals were arrested, tortured, and executed by Diem. In 1957, the Viet Cong became more organized in its insurgency and attacked many government officials and other parties. In 1959, they started to engage the South Vietnamese army in firefights. They later became known as the NLF. The NLF, or the National Liberation Front, claimed not to be a puppet, but it was thought that by the CIA and many other parties that they were a puppet of the North Vietnam Party. In 1961, John F. Kennedy, after reports of dire situation in Vietnam, began to send short support short of a military intervention. In 1962, the U.S. military presence in Vietnam had reached 9,000 troops compared to less than 800 available in 1950s. Following the coup of Diem in 1963, Kennedy was assassinated 3 weeks later. Lyndon B. Johnson took up the role as president with Robert McNamara as defense. They began to ramp up U.S. involvement, and in 1964, after reports of torpedo boats attacking U.S. vessels, Johnson ordered a retaliatory bombing by Congress. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin, allowing for the paths of Operation Rolling Thunder, which saw the increased bombardment of North Vietnam. From 1964 to 1973, the U.S. dropped 2 million tons of bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail to disrupt the supply lines of the Viet Cong. In March of 1965, with U.S. public support, Johnson sent 82,000 troops stationed in Vietnam. Amid growing anti-war concerns, Johnson then sent another 200,000 more soldiers by the end of 1966. Countries such as Thailand, Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand also sent soldiers, but not in as large quantities. Despite air raids, the South was mainly fought on foot under the orders of General William Westmoreland. Westmoreland aimed to fight a battle in which the U.S. soldiers killed as many Vietnamese as possible to break their fighting spirit. This led to the creation of fire-free zones, where bombs could be dropped and there was believed to be no acting civilians in the area. With this, civilians fled to cities and flooded as refugees. Despite the rise in casualties of the Viet Cong, they continued to fight with renewed manpower and resources from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Protests continued in America as casualties rose, reaching 15,058 killed. This growing anti-war sentiment on both the grounds of Vietnam and U.S. soil led to soldiers deteriorating physically and mentally, leading to increased drug usage, PTSD from those who returned, and mutinies, including often to officers who were more gung-ho about fighting the Vietnamese. Being televised, the war, it shocked many, and 35,000 protesters took to the streets to protest the war, arguing civilians were the most hurt by this war. The Tet Offensive began on January 31st, 1968. 70,000 North Vietnamese soldiers led the Tet Offensive. It was a coordinated attack on 100 cities in South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive shocked the U.S. as the U.S. repeated assurance of winning the war was contrasted with 200,000 more soldiers being sent into Vietnam. Johnson, seeing the public opinion, halted the bombings of North Vietnam and entered talks in Paris. However, these talks quickly broke down as Viet Cong representatives and South Vietnamese were invited. In 1968, President Nixon came into office. President Nixon began Vietnamization, by withdrawing American troops and increasing the usage of aerial bombing in North Vietnam instead. However, with the continued withdrawal of Americans, there was still the My Lai incident. This is where soldiers went into a village called My Lai and massacred 400 innocent civilians who were unarmed. This only increased the anti-war sentiment that raged on, especially in college campuses. In Kent State University, Ohio, after a protest, National Guard were sent in, which led to the death of 4 students after being shot. 10 days later, 2 more students were killed in Jackson State University. After all, the Vietnam War only ended in 1973, nearly 19 years after it began. However, the war had devastating effects on both sides. In Vietnam, it faced huge losses of life, estimated at 2 million were killed, 3 million casualties injured, and 12 million refugees. The country's infrastructure was devastated, as it resulted in many of the cities being destroyed in the fighting from bombing and continued attacks. Reconstruction only began slowly. In 1976, Vietnam was unified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, though in 1986 implemented more free trade policies to speed up its economic involvement. The U.S. also fared badly. nation had lost its myth of American invincibility up to this time following World War II and the Korean War. Many returning veterans faced negative reactions after returning home, both from those who supported the war and those who were against it. So ones against it saw them as killers, and those who supported it saw them as losers. The U.S. spent more than $120 billion on the war, leading to widespread inflation. Unfortunately, many Vietnam veterans and their children were affected on both sides due to the compound Agent Orange, which led to many birth defects and cancer. It is clear to see that the Vietnam War was one of true loss and unfortunate circumstances for all parties involved. From the lead up to the hopeful party that wanted to free Vietnam from foreign influence, to an unfortunate war that saw a huge loss of life, to the issues that affect many today, including culturally and physically. It's important to American history that we remember Vietnam as what it was, a mistake, a bloody mistake. Many people have heard knowing history is the best way to avoid repeating it, and I truly hope that many people take it to heart as we look to news on future conflicts. When looking at Vietnam War, it's easy to see the parallels between Ukraine and the war in Israel, and how U.S. involvement can not only be not welcome, it can be harmful. It can lead to increased issues. Thank you. Questions?